Hello, everybody. Welcome to press briefing from the Foreign Press Association, where once again we're delighted to have a forthright, articulate, and non non-weaselly um, interlocutor with Ambassador John Bolton, who has strong opinions about Donald Trump and Ukraine. And more to the point, I think, which we appreciate here, is he's not afraid to vocalize them, unlike many of the Republican field who are looking over their shoulders and scared to alienate people. So they ignore the truth when it comes up. Uh, John has no such inhibitions, as we know. But John, I mean, this week has been who'd ever have thought that a former president would be buried under so many writs? That he's up in front of more grand juries than probably anyone in the history of the United States political system. What is can he survive?
Right. Well, I think let me talk a little bit about Trump, and then maybe go on to Ukraine, and then maybe East Asia, and then we can see if there are questions and things like that. But I think those are sort of the three most visible topics. In the case of Trump, I think some people are surprised now with the fourth indictment that he hasn't suffered more political damage, and it's yet possible that he will decline further in the polls. I think there's some slight decline, but that could just be a bump. Um, and I think the reason is that it turns out criminal indictments are subject to the law of marginal utility, just like everything else is. People have become inured to them, and I suspect that will be true for a lot of the coverage of the pretrial proceedings and maybe even the trials themselves. The big question, if I may suggest to some press people, if the big question is whether any of these trials are scheduled and held before the election, and if so, what the outcome is. There's a lot of preparation and pretrial work that will happen. The one thing that matters is what the juries come back with, because I think if Trump is convicted in one or more of these cases, that is the kind of earthquake that really could upset the pattern we see in the polling and could turn the electorate against him conclusively. Now, on the other hand, it's why there's a risk in proceeding legally at all here. If he wins, if he is acquitted in one or more of these cases, or if he gets a hung jury, that is to say, the jury can't reach a unanimous verdict, and he will spin a hung jury as tantamount to an acquittal. That will validate his argument that this whole thing was just a big witch hunt. He's being persecuted. I think it would guarantee him the Republican nomination and quite possibly the election in November of 2024. So time is relatively short. The Republican convention is just about a year away in late August of next year. But the primaries and caucuses begin in January. So the scheduling of the trials is really pretty significant. Many Republicans will have to vote without knowing whether the person they're voting for could be a convicted felon by the time of the Republican convention. And whatever effect it has on Trump's supporters within the Republican Party, I really don't think most Americans want to elect a convicted felon as president. So there's a disjunction between people rallying to Trump's support in the primary fight and turning away from him in the general election. So it's possible that a convicted Trump could go down to serious defeat in November of next year and take a big chunk of the Republican Party with him. So all this says to me that whatever a particular national poll says today or tomorrow, the next day, there's still a long way to go here and ample opportunity to explain to voters in Iowa, New Hampshire, other early states that they don't want to put themselves, the country, or the party at risk by voting for somebody who may be on his way to jail by the time we meet to select the candidate. And I think that that notwithstanding all that you hear now about the seriousness of the indictments and how many years in jail Trump could get, the one question all this comes down to is, will there be one or more trials before the election, and does he get convicted or not? So somewhere in the midst of this campaign, we'll have to turn to other questions, which the rest of the world is answering for. They're not content to wait until November next year, and I think that's a potential period of vulnerability for the United States. While we're focused inward, countries that are not our friends will try and take advantage of our lack of attention. What I'm worried about today are just 2 points, and I'll cover them quickly, and then I'm happy to answer questions, of course. First is Ukraine. The second is East Asia and Taiwan. On Ukraine, and I've just written this in the Wall Street Journal on Monday in abbreviated form. Obviously, the Ukrainian spring offensive is not having the success we had hoped it would have. It's making small advances, to be sure, but nothing significant strategically at this point. I think one reason for that is the inordinate delays in getting equipment, weapons, intelligence to the Ukrainians, the distribution of this assistance in non-strategic ways that gave the Russians time to fortify and dig in along their defensive lines to make it as difficult as it clearly is for the Ukrainians to advance. And what I'm worried about is that absent some change in that fundamental military balance, sometime in September, October, the early fall, I worry that Moscow will say, this war has gone on long enough, 18 months. Let's have a ceasefire. Let's have negotiations. Let's turn the page on this. And we will find plenty of people in Europe and plenty of people in the United States that say that's a great idea. And if there is a ceasefire along the existing lines of control, Russia will have doubled its control over Ukrainian territory since 2014, obviously at a very high price in human terms, but that's their calculus. That's our calculus, rather, not theirs. They will have doubled their territory, and Putin can rest and recuperate to come back and do it again in 5 or 6 years and stabilize his position in Russia. So I think we need a counter strategy. I think it's not enough to say we're in this with Ukraine until the end. The way we ought to look at it is we're in this to win as soon as possible so that the rest of Ukraine isn't ground into the dust in the course of this war. I think that'll be a big test of the Biden administration and, frankly, of the strength of the NATO alliance. We hear a lot about how it's stronger now than it's been in a long time. And the answer may be yes, but subject to what the outcome in Ukraine is. You can't keep an alliance together on good intentions. It has to succeed. And that's part of the test. To turn to the Far East quickly. President Biden on Friday will host what I think could be a very significant trilateral summit with President Yoon of South Korea and Prime Minister Kishida of Japan. The first real trilateral summit, not in connection with a G20 or a UN General Assembly meeting. And the huge strategic and conceptual question that they will be addressing through specific areas is, can the U.S. system of hub and spoke alliances in the Indo-Pacific be transformed into collective self-defense? Now, nobody is expecting NATO tomorrow, for sure, for all kinds of historical reasons. But the idea of having trilateral strategizing, trilateral sharing of intelligence information, trilateral exercises, as opposed to U.S.-South Korean exercises or U.S.-Japan exercises, is a huge step forward. And it has implications not just in Northeast Asia, but really across the Indo-Pacific. One of the issues that they should talk about tomorrow is Taiwan and the threat that China poses to Taiwan, because it sits in the East China Sea. These are literally the waters around Korea and Japan. If you ask people in Japan today, do you consider an attack on Taiwan to be an attack on Japan? They would say yes. 2 or 3 years ago, if you had asked that question in South Korea, I think most would say no. I think that's changing. I think today they would say yes. And Taiwan is the linchpin, the key pivot point in the first island chain that links Northeast Asia with Southeast Asia and ultimately on to the South Indian subcontinent, South Asian subcontinent, and the Indian Ocean. So Taiwan has got to be a particular focus of this trilateral discussion, which then needs to be expanded. We're on the verge of a huge change around the world. I really think we're at the end of the post-Cold War era. I think the Russian-Chinese alliance indicates we've moved beyond the post-Cold War era. And the question is, can the United States and its allies deal with that new challenge, whether it's in Ukraine or with respect to Taiwan? And this summit here in Washington tomorrow with South Korea and Japan is going to be a big, big part of that. So, Ian, with apologies, I've probably gone on too long, but just to set the table, and happy to answer questions about things I didn't cover as well, whatever is on your mind.
It's all good. So I'd like to just lead off with this week, for example, a NATO senior official was leaking, or not so much leaking as indiscreetly saying that maybe a deal that left some land on the table in return for a peace treaty would be okay. And it's this type of language that's coming that must give aid and comfort to the Kremlin, that there are people here who are continue. I mean, apart from the obvious ones like Orban in Budapest, but there are people in NATO and people in the United States who are continuing saying, "Oh well, let's be reasonable. Let's consider it," which is surely bringing aid and comfort to the enemy in that sense.
Well, I think that's right. Look, I think if the Russians are able to contain the spring offensive, that they will at that point be able to say the war has dragged on long enough inconclusively that a diplomatic solution is the only way out of this. And what Putin is going to try and do is win in the negotiating room what his military has failed to win on the battlefield, and he is counting on weakness in the West. I have always believed that his time in the KGB in East Germany had a profound impact on his view of Germany as a whole. He thinks he knows Germany well. He may be right or he may be wrong, but he thinks he knows Germany well. And I think he believes he knows the point at which Germany might break, and along with France and people in the US. You know, we just saw in Germany in the past 48 hours, the governing coalition being unable to sustain a push to write into law Germany's commitment to meet the 2% of GDP NATO target. Now, you know, the government says different things. That doesn't mean they won't try and reach 2%, but this is a long way from the sea change that Chancellor Scholz promised some time back. And I think Putin has taken due note of that as well. Within the Republican Party, let's be clear: the virus of isolationism is unleashed again, and that's something we're going to have to take care of in the next campaign as well.
Yes, it's completely expedient. Any bat to hit the incumbent with, regardless of the consequences geopolitically, isn't it?
Right. Well, it's part of the problem when you have the naturally dovish party fighting a war and the naturally hawkish party in opposition, and it makes things confusing. I think Republicans, by and large, remain a Reaganite party, not a Trump party when it comes to national security. But that question is somewhat more open now than it was before.
Well, I suppose one of the questions here, Jonathan Kapstein, do you want to speak out on this? We wanted to get some live discourse in here.
Ian, your screen is frozen, at least for me, by the way. You may want to
Okay, I'll attend to that.
hit it with a wrench or whatever you do.
Jonathan Kapstein, can you speak? Can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
I'm trying to, yes. You are frozen, Ian.
I know. It's okay.
Morning, Mr. Ambassador. I'm a former foreign correspondent for many years. But I have a question about domestic U.S. politics, which is what's with this turmoil in the Republican Party unleashed by Mr. Trump. what's the future of the party? Does it disappear the way the Whigs did? I mean, what's your fear here as we come up to an election? That's
Well,
question one, and I have another one about foreign affairs in a moment.
okay. Well, I don't think we're in any danger of going the way of the Whigs. You know, the American political system up to 1860 was very inchoate and changed around a good deal. Not that different than parliamentary developments in Great Britain during that same time period, but we have hardened into a two-party system really since Lincoln's election in 1860, and I don't fundamentally see that changing. What I worry about is that if Trump gets the nomination next year, even apart from what happens to him in the criminal cases, that the party could be defeated in a way that puts the Democrats not only in control of the White House, but the Senate and the House of Representatives as well, and passing legislation that will be very, very damaging on a wide range of fronts. So that to me is yet another reason why we've got to find a way to nominate a candidate other than Trump. And I think, as I say, I think this remains very much in play. And for the good of the country, not just the good of the party. Obviously, that's why we're trying to succeed.
We've seen
Jonathan, do you
a
want to
number
follow
of
up?
recent elections, third party not have a major receive a major voter turnout, but enough to actually sway the election. Do you see that as a possibility, the eruption from either the left or the right?
Well, there is. I don't think the Cornell West on some socialist party or another on the left. I don't think that's going to be a major factor. I think the question is what the no labels group is able to do. They've been getting on the ballot in a number of states to be able to run a third party or independent candidate if it's a race between Trump and Biden again. Very, very unclear exactly how that's going to develop. Uh, Analysts from the Democratic Party and Republican Party are completely confused about what no labels impact would be. I can't make up my own mind. What I remember, the last significant independent candidate, third party candidate, was Ross Perot in 1992, who got, I think, about 19% of the vote and guaranteed Bill Clinton's election. So I instinctively fear third parties that where there's such dissatisfaction with Trump as there is in the Republican Party, that no labels could draw off a relatively large Republican vote and give the election to the Democrats.
Thank you.
Okay. Simon, do you want to come in on the question of whether if Trump is actually convicted, can he run, and would the public not give him the underdog support? We voted for him regardless. We don't care about the conviction.
Yeah, Ian, you wrapped up the question quite well. The question really is, from a legal basis, what should we understand if Trump is convicted but were to be elected? I assume this would be new territory, but what is the legal context that we should be thinking about?
Right. Well, we're in uncharted territory from the beginning of being indicted, both as a former president and a presidential candidate, let alone with four major criminal cases against him. And it's one argument to make to voters is that electing Trump guarantees a constitutional crisis every day of a second 4-year term. This is certainly part of Trump's legal defense is a political defense. As many have observed, and I think it's right. If he is elected, when he is sworn in, he obviously oversees the work of the Justice Department, and he could order the Attorney General to terminate the special counsel, dismiss the prosecutions, and end the cases. He could, if he's been convicted, pardon himself. Now, that's never been tested. But I have read the pardon power in the Constitution very carefully, and there's no limitation on it. It doesn't say he can extend pardons except for himself. It just says he has the pardon power. And remember, the model of the executive is the monarchy in England, which had sweeping power. That's why we separated them to prevent concentration of power in one branch. But the prerogatives of the of the president are very broad, so he could pardon himself. Now, the real difficulty comes because of the Georgia and New York prosecutions. One, a Fulton County in Georgia, the other, a county, Manhattan, the district attorney for Manhattan in New York. Under our Constitution, the federal government has no control over those prosecutions, nor can a president pardon people convicted of state or local offenses, including himself. So we could have a situation where if these trials didn't begin till after the election, he could be convicted in a state court sometime in 2025. And what happens when the police from Georgia arrive to arrest him and take him into custody at the Northwest Gate at the White House? What happens then? We don't know because it's never happened. But if, knowing Donald Trump as I do, I think he'd say it's a witch hunt, it's a fake court case. I'm not going to pay any attention to it. What happens then? We just don't know, and it's that kind of uncertainty and turmoil that could hurt the United States internationally to a very substantial degree. It's why it's not worth the risk for the Republican Party to nominate Trump, that there must be at least one other person who doesn't face criminal indictment who can run a credible campaign and be a conservative president. That's what we've got to try and convince Republican voters of.
Right. Well, while you're mentioning people sort of playing in the undergrowth while the big battle's going on elsewhere, Jordan de Kamsa, if you wants to ask about Palestine and Israel, which has fallen to the back because there are clear signs that the extremists in Israel and the West Bank are taking advantage of the chaos to advance an agenda that a stronger president might pull the lead on them.
Good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador. Nice to see you, and thank you, Ian, for this opportunity. My name is Jordan de Kamsa. I'm the publisher of the Jordan Report, which focuses on the relationship between the U.S. and Jordan. And of course, the Palestinian issue is one of those issues that interrelate between the two countries. My question, actually, if Trump is elected, and there is a possibility, what do you think will happen to the deal of the century, which he was promising to solve the Palestine-Israel situation? Secondly, if he asks you to rejoin his team, either his staff or his administration, what will be your answer? The third one, what do you think will happen to Jerusalem? Because as Ian mentioned rightfully, the Israeli extreme sometimes they undermine the Jordanian role, which is clearly stated in history, and also in the Israel-Jordan peace treaty, that Jordan has the right to control and to administrate the Aqsa Mosque. Thank you so much.
Well, let me answer your second question first. I don't think he will ask me to rejoin a second Trump administration. And if he did, I wouldn't. I did 17 months. It's like doing time almost. I did 17 months in his first term. And I'm not sure how long I would last in a second term. I will say more seriously, this is another potential problem in a Trump administration. And I leave myself out of the picture, but I think certainly in the national security space, the best people on the Republican side would not go in at all. I went in the first term because I believe that, like every prior president, Trump would be weighted down by the gravity of the decisions he had to make in the national security space, and it would discipline him. It turned out I was completely wrong on that. So that's why he's a danger in and of himself, and I don't know who his advisors would be. In terms of the Palestinian question, I think one of the things that the Biden team is working on now, and they may or may not succeed, is extending the Abraham Accords to include Saudi Arabia and Israel. And there's press speculation that could involve some question on the West Bank and the future of Palestinian Israeli issues. I don't know whether that's true or not. but that could be something that would come into play even before Trump is elected. I think the big question is what Trump would do on Iran, and I think that would particularly affect the Gulf Arab countries, but Jordan as well, because uh, uh, the enormous confluence of interest between Israel and the Arab states in the Middle East, they're seeing Iran really as their common largest threat, is something the Biden administration simply doesn't get at all. And I do think the Gulf Arab states in particular are hoping that a new administration would see Iran the same way we do, the same way they do. And I don't know whether that'll happen or not. And I would just say, don't count on Trump necessarily following the pattern that he followed in the first term in any particular area. Remember, under the U.S. Constitution, this second term would be his last term. He will never face the voters again if he serves a second term. And therefore, the political constraint that existed in the first term of having to worry about whether a given decision would affect his reelection wouldn't be part of the discussion. And what Trump always focused on most was, how does this affect me politically? So I think that President Macron of France at the G7 meeting in Biarritz in the summer of 2019 had Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, hidden away somewhere in Biarritz. He wanted Trump to meet with him. It almost happened because Trump could see another deal of the century that he would make with the Ayatollahs. I urged him not to do it, as did others. Some urged that he should. Ultimately, he didn't do it. But in a second Trump term, the political calculus for Trump would be very different. And so how he would view the Palestinian question, how he would view the Iranian nuclear threat, the terrorist threat, all could be very different. And especially since Trump doesn't have a particular philosophy and he doesn't follow coherent policies, it's all what in the moment benefits him. I think it's very much up in the air how he would perform in the Middle East.
Well, the third, if you don't mind, the third one was about the role of Jordan in Jerusalem, as stated in the Israeli-Jordanian peace accord.
Right. I'm sorry. I apologize for omitting that. Look, I think that that's something that Trump doesn't know anything about in all probability. I think in terms of stability in the region, that Israel may care more about that than Trump does. But I agree. I think instability in Jordan because of a failure to comply with agreements that have been made in the past, destabilization there could have a negative effect, obviously, not only in Jordan, but around the region, very much contrary to American interest.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So could we move to, I think Frank Gomez has an interesting point. One of the parts of the war in Ukraine has been the amazing success of the Russians in persuading everybody that they're cozy anti-imperialists who are, against colonial hegemony across the world. And they've, well, some of them aren't so surprising, to be honest, but they've got people out the woodwork thinking that they're the underdogs, who really know better. But so how go on, Frank, you weigh in there. It's your question. Frank?
Thanks, Ian, and hello, Ambassador. I'm a former Foreign Service officer, by the way. My question has to do with Russian and Cuban and other influences, nefarious influences in Venezuela and other countries in the region. These pressures are going on constantly, and yet we don't seem to have a strategy to deal with them. It's just Maduro is going to face elections in November of next year, and he's probably going to block the opposition in one way or another, control the media. And what is the American approach to that kind of situation? Is it going to go on forever?
Well, I think the Biden administration has paid far too little attention to many events in Latin America. I mean, the focus has been on Mexico and the border. But around the hemisphere, there's a lot going on. I think a lot of efforts by China in particular to increase its influence through the Belt and Road Initiative and other things, and obviously the Russians in Cuba and Venezuela. Look, the failure to overthrow Maduro when Juan Guaido was given the presidency because Maduro had fixed the election in 2018. It was a huge opportunity. It didn't take place. It's a great tragedy in Venezuela, but it's a signal that around the hemisphere, I think problematic regimes with potential foreign external support see an opportunity to get themselves in place in ways that are very hard to change later. So, look, I had to be honest. In the past several decades, new American presidents come in. They all say we're going to pay more attention to Latin America, and then routinely they don't do it. So we need an American president who, as a candidate, will say, "I'm going to pay more attention to Latin America," and this time actually do it. You know, I don't know who that candidate is. I can assure you, it's not Donald Trump. We had enough trouble keeping him online in trying to support Juan Guaido, support the Lima process of the Latin American governments that were trying to assist him. And it's just, as I say, again, a tragedy we weren't able to do enough.
Robert Delaney, would you like to come in on your question about the small country, faraway country of which we know nothing?
Yes. Thank you very much, Ian, for doing this, and thank you, Ambassador, for joining us. I just wanted to follow up on your comments about East Asia and Taiwan. You mentioned you had a point about the virus of isolationism in the Republican Party, and it's fairly apparent how that is playing out when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. I'm not sure, is it, I don't see it quite as much because when it comes to Taiwan and East Asia, just because you have so many stridently anti-Beijing lawmakers, all expressing quite strong support for Taiwan. So, you know, in the event of a second Trump presidency, do you see the same level of isolationism when it comes to Taiwan?
Well, it's certainly true that the Chinese threat has gotten a lot of attention in recent months, and the bipartisan select committee in the House, chaired by Mike Gallagher, a young Republican from Wisconsin, somebody to watch, I think somebody with a real national future potentially, has worked hand in glove with the Democratic side of that committee to try and keep things together. And, you know, the administration, I will say, Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo has done a remarkable job extending the sanctions, especially in the high-tech information technology area, even beyond what was put in place in the Trump administration. But I'm not at all sure that everybody's necessarily marching to the same drum. And in the sense of Taiwan in particular, while there's very widespread concern about the Chinese threat, and I think widespread agreement we should be helping Taiwan, there's much less agreement on whether that actually means fighting for Taiwan if it comes down to it. I think that's where one split takes place. And the other is that, and this is, I think, more within the Republican Party than anything else, there's a view that, and I'm going to oversimplify, but the view is that China is really not only the main threat for the rest of the century, but the only threat for the rest of the century. And that we have to focus all of our attention on East Asia and particularly on Taiwan, and have to ditch secondary areas of concern like the Middle East or like Europe. And so one of the reasons that people argue we shouldn't be giving military assistance to Ukraine is we may need to give it to Taiwan. Now, that's notwithstanding the assistance involved is very different. Taiwan's 100 miles away by sea from China. Ukraine has a common border, just to name the most obvious difference. But I think this focus on Taiwan and Asia, I have no doubt that China is the principal threat to the U.S. and its allies for the rest of the century. But the threat is not geographically limited. The very fact of the Beijing-Moscow axis the partnership without limits, this time with China in the driver's seat and Russia as the subordinate partner, means that this is a global, possibly a global realignment into a new bipolar world. The Russia-China axis and its outriders, North Korea, Iran, Belarus, maybe a few others on the one hand, and the U.S. and its friends, whoever those might turn out to be, on the other. You know, if you're the United States and you say, well, I don't care that much about the Middle East anymore, I have to worry about East Asia, I'll guarantee you the next day China's going to turn up in the Middle East. It's already happened. After the Chinese helped broker the restoration of diplomatic relations between Saudi and Iran, the week after that, if I recall correctly, Russia, China, and Iran conducted joint naval maneuvers in the Arabian Sea. So while we're looking at the South China Sea and the East China Sea, the Chinese are in the Arabian Sea. And in Ukraine, it's perfectly obvious China is supplying extraordinarily important assistance to Russia, buying their oil and gas, helping to launder Russian money through the opaque Chinese financial system to escape financial sanctions, supplying dual-use equipment at a minimum to the Russians, and probably weapons, if you want my humble opinion. So this idea that, and what worries me is that people who say we shouldn't pay attention to threats in Europe, too far away, Middle East too far away, but we do care about threats to Taiwan, that position lasts right up until there's a threat from Taiwan. And these same people then say, you know, it's a little too far away, and we lose in all three areas. I think if you're, I don't like the word internationalist. I call myself pro-American in my foreign policy. But if you don't understand that our interests and threats to our interest are global and deal with them that way, then you're kind of missing the point.
Okay, could we go to Robert Papa? Because while we're talking about brush fires breaking out, we've seen people taking advantage in Kosovo, for example, on the brush fires. There are always people with a box of matches and a bottle of gasoline prepared to take advantage of the major firefighters being distracted. So, Robert Papa, do you want to come in with your question on the Balkans? Hello, are you unmuted?
Yes, do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, Ambassador, nice to talk to you again. What's going in the Balkan future if Trump wins again? Biden administration is so weak for Balkans, and they're supporting former communists in Albania, as you know.
Well, I think the Biden administration policy in the Balkans is as incoherent as it is in almost any other place. I think it's just not something that they've thought about since the Clinton administration and the Dayton Accords. And I don't think, notwithstanding the war in Ukraine, they appreciate the potential for destabilization. I mean, I think there's a lot we could be doing that we're not doing. I just don't know what a Trump policy would be there. I certainly spent some of my time trying to resolve the differences between Serbia and Kosovo, for example. I thought it was worthwhile. I thought the parties might be able to reach agreement. That didn't work out. It doesn't mean it's any less important, shouldn't be any less important next time around. But remember, Trump has threatened to withdraw from NATO, and I think he's serious about that. I can't predict what his timing would be, but I think if the U.S. did withdraw from NATO and that source of protection and stability were to disappear, I think all kinds of bad things would happen, not just in the Balkans, but throughout Eastern and Central Europe.
Next, let's move to Kathleen Thomas. And Kathleen, since I know it's a particular predilection of yours, apart from the question you put up there, you might want to throw in about Western Sahara and Morocco as well, since the ambassador had dealings with it in the past.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Oh, yes. Ambassador Bolton and I have worked for years on the issue of Western Sahara. So I know him and he knows me. And I could ask him about Western Sahara. But first, we're talking about Trump here. So I want to ask a question about Trump. I'd like to know what you think of the argument that the Constitution prohibits an official who commits insurrection from holding office. Do you think this would apply to Trump? If so, who would determine whether this applies? The Supreme Court, Congress, the states, and who would have standing to file such a claim if one could be filed?
Right. Well, I've read that provision very carefully since January the 6th, and I know different people have asserted that it could be a bar to Trump serving in any federal office, obviously, including the presidency. And I understand that a couple of Federalist Society law professors actually have concluded that it does bar Trump, and they're going to publish a big law review article on it next year, which is great, except it doesn't help us in the meantime. I would say, I think it's pretty clear, given that this provision is in the 14th Amendment, it was written with the Civil War in mind, to bar former Confederates from holding offices under the United States. The language of the particular provision itself doesn't limit itself to the Civil War. It is written in a way that could be applied later, but the fact is the provision is itself not self-executing. In other words, it doesn't say that Congress may by law implement this provision. I mean, Congress could have, but they've effectively chosen not to. So I don't know what the mechanism is to prevent Trump from continuing to run, whether or not he was guilty of insurrection. That's the key point. You can say that January the 6th was an insurrection, but who validates that point? Who says, yes, constitutionally it was an insurrection? January the 6th was a terrible day for the United States, one of the saddest days in our history. But let's be clear, it doesn't compare to the Civil War. I mean, it was a pretty pathetic insurrection, if that's what it was. So it's my view is that ultimately, when you have this kind of disagreement over somebody like Donald Trump, the safest way, the best way constitutionally for the country to resolve it is politically, to defeat Donald Trump, to deny Donald Trump the Republican nomination, or if he gets it, to make sure he doesn't win the presidency again. And thinking that there's a legal kind of silver bullet out there that's going to, I mean this metaphorically, of course, that's going to solve our problems, the prosecutions that are underway now or something else, I think is putting too much reliance on non-political methods. I wish we didn't even have to worry about it. I'm open to the idea because, as I say, as a textualist and originalist, the Constitution itself in the area you're talking about is not limited to the Civil War. But I need to see a much more convincing argument about how to make this decision in a systematic way. And I don't think anybody has yet proposed that.
We're coming towards any more questions from anybody, but I'd like to ask you, Ambassador. We've had several months, and I think we asked the question then. You want a political solution. Would you consider any role that you'll be part of a political solution?
Well, I've been considering running myself for quite some time, hoping that in the meantime, somebody would come forward to make what I think is the real case against Donald Trump, which is he's not fit to be president. He didn't understand the job when he took it in 2017. He didn't know very much more when he left it in 2021. He obviously hasn't learned anything since then. He doesn't make decisions in a careful way, considering what the U.S. interests are. He considers what Donald Trump's interests are. And I think for any of the Republican candidates, if they want to beat Donald Trump for the nomination, they have to beat Donald Trump. They can't beat the 15 other candidates. They've got to beat Donald Trump. They've got to convince Republican voters in the primaries that they are qualified to be president and he is not. Now, some are more critical of Trump recently than others have been, but I'm still looking at it. This is a very strange election cycle, to say the least. And I think people could come in late at the end of it. There's continuing talk about Governor Kemp of Georgia, about Governor Youngkin of Virginia. And I think there are others who may be looking at it as well. But I believe fundamentally this is a Republican issue. I think we've got to stop Trump. I think it's our responsibility. I'm not counting on the media to do it. I'm not counting on the Democrats to do it. I just don't think he should get the Republican nomination. I'm focused on that.
Well, looking at the field, aren't we in danger of a repetition of the Trump factor? That you get one person with a massive ego, massive media following, and a stage presence, and confronting a crowd of non-entities. So
Yeah.
If in the battle against the Lilliputians, Gulliver always wins. So is there
Yeah.
another Gulliver out there?
Well, we'll have to find that out. But I do think that that having gone through this once in the 2016 campaign, the party as a whole is aware that through a series of mistakes that Trump was able to capitalize on, he got the nomination. I would point to the upcoming presidential debate on August the 23rd, next week, as a potential pivot point, that people are going to be saying, if a candidate other than Trump hasn't caught fire by them and doesn't catch fire on that debate stage, that there's going to be a lot of pressure on those candidates to withdraw. That won't solve the problem entirely, but I think winnowing the field down could be of substantial importance. And I think that is the first time when really everybody's going to be together on one stage at the same time, absent Trump. There's speculation, you can place bets on it if you want, that Trump will take that afternoon to go down to Atlanta and surrender and be arraigned, so that all of the coverage before the debate and maybe right through the debate will be on him having his mugshot taken and that sort of thing, and undercut the debate itself. But I do think that's a potential turning point just a week away.
We're coming towards the end, but Simon, he's given me permission to ask the question on his behalf. Well, what is your take on Niger and the West African imbroglio with Moscow? It's a long way from Siberia, but they seem to be rampaging across there and getting their own way. And as a former, as State Department and Foreign Affairs, how do you explain the abysmal lack of intelligence on part of the United States that an army they paid for, trained and equipped, managed to stage a coup without anyone hearing about it till afterwards?
Well, it wasn't our finest hour, I suppose. I mean, this is something that has been coming for a long time. It's not simply because of the Wagner Group, or even simply because of the rise of Islamic terrorism through the Sahelian countries. I mean, what we're seeing here is the last stages, the final stages, really, of the breakdown of the French Empire, where they've just lost all influence over former French Africa. And despite, I think, pretty substantial efforts by the United States and some others, we haven't been able to replace the French presence with sufficient stability that we can avoid this kind of thing. And the Russians are there to take advantage of it, and so are the Chinese. You would have thought that the Europeans, not to pick on our friends there too much, but you would have thought, since their concern about stability in North Africa rests in large part on not having much of North Africa move across the Mediterranean to southern Europe, the Italians especially, from across the Mediterranean, across from Libya, which remains in a state of effective anarchy at this point. And yet the European Union, after years of deliberation, much of which consisted of asking the United States to take on this role, have found themselves unable to do it. The French are a shadow of their former presence. I think our folks in the Africa Command, and by the way, that was a huge step by the United States 10 years ago or more, to split off from the European Command, to split off an African Command, have to be very disappointed that this has happened. And I'm sure when Congress comes back from the long August recess, they're going to ask a lot of questions along the line that you and Simon are posing. I don't know the answer to it. I was amazed myself, but it's a very bad sign, because if it can happen in Niger, which, by the way, in case anybody's forgotten, is the source of a lot of natural uranium that goes into world markets, it's a problem across North Africa.
Well, it looks like we've come to the end, and just following on from this, our next briefing, with date to be arranged, is with Masha Karp, the former BBC Russian language correspondent, who has written a book on George Orwell and the Soviet Union, which is relevant in all sorts of ways. For those of you who take these things seriously, as you should, it's the 120th anniversary of George Orwell's birth. And one thinks of him shaking his head ruefully as he sees his prophecies play out. It was supposed to be a warning, not a prediction, not a playbook. So that's coming up soon, along with the rest. Thank you very much to Ambassador Bolton once again for a forthright, no holds barred. I don't believe there's anybody else in the Republican Party who will speak their mind with looking over their shoulder and taking sort of shadow polls on whether being rude about Donald Trump will backsplash on them in future career. I don't think Ambassador Bolton's concerned about Trump's effect on his future career. So thank you very much again. I look forward to seeing you in the future as all of these events unfold and burn out. Thank you, John.
Okay, take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye.